I figured it out. You know, I was going through turmoil at home, personally. You know, with my wife. It wasn't her fault. It was my fault.
Smokey Robinson speaks I's steady voice, dropping low, as if reaching deep into a memory he once tried to bury. The words aren't just a confession about a broken marriage. They're a door cracked open, leading to a chain of untold secrets about love, betrayal, addiction, conflicted relationships, and a side of Motown few dare to touch. At 84, he no longer avoids it. But is what Smokey shares the whole truth, or just the part he's chosen to reveal? What lies hidden behind the glittering light of Motown? Follow this journey and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to uncover the rest of the truth. To understand why it took nearly a century for Smokey Robinson to finally speak, we have to go back to the beginning. Not the stage lights, nor the nights spent composing at the piano, but the days he chose silence when the truth was still too painful to name. From the slums of Detroit to the shine of Motown. Born in 1940, Smokey Robinson. Full name, William Smokey Robinson Jr. was the only son in a household of 11, all crammed into a rundown home in North End Detroit. When he was just 10, his mother passed away. In one of the darkest moments of his life, his eldest sister, already a mother of 6, moved back in, bringing all her children with her. The house instantly became an enormous home in terms of people, but utterly empty in terms of material wealth. There were no private rooms, no personal beds, no full meals. But one thing was never lacking: love. Smokey recalls, with a faint, bittersweet smile, that having 3 kids squeezed into a single bed was completely normal. "I didn't know I was poor until I left there," he said. Poverty doesn't register in a child's mind when everyone around them is equally poor. In that neighborhood, no doors were locked, not out of trust, but because there was nothing worth stealing. No one would think of breaking into a house where a dozen people were already sleeping under a thin blanket. It was the love within the family that kept Smokey's spirit from collapsing. "We had love, and we loved each other," he once said. Love not as a lofty ideal in ballads, but as a survival force. The only thing that could make someone feel rich, even when their stomach was empty. That deep sense of being loved and protected became the foundation of the extraordinary strength within an artist who would later be known across the world as a symbol of grace, sensitivity, and emotional power. But Detroit was no paradise for dreamers. It was a place where young black men were easily swallowed up by the streets, by violence, by factory life, and by suffocating routine. Yet this skinny boy chose a different path: music. By the age of 14, Smokey was already passionate about songwriting. He had written hundreds of songs, over 100 of them, before ever having the chance to stand before a professional microphone. These early lyrics were penned in silence, jotted in old notebooks, unseen and unheard by anyone else. Only Smokey knew them. But he believed that every word had the power to save him from becoming just another name in the cycle of his neighborhood. The turning point came in 1957, when Smokey, now the leader of a vocal group called the Matadors, later renamed the Miracles, went to audition at Brunswick Records. They were rejected. But that audition unexpectedly led to a meeting with Berry Gordy, a young sharp man who shared Smokey's dream of turning music into a life-changing force. Gordy wasn't just impressed by Smokey's voice, he was especially drawn to the thick notebook stuffed with dozens of songs the teenage Smokey had written during high school. "This kid isn't just a singer, he's a creator," Barry said. The connection between them quickly blossomed into one of the most powerful partnerships in the history of American music. With Gordy's support, Smokey and the Miracles released their first single, "Got a Job," a biting response to the hit "Get a Job" by the Silhouettes. The song marked not only the official debut of the Miracles, but also the beginning of an empire, Motown Records. At the time, Smokey was studying electrical engineering at college, but within 2 months, he dropped out. "I knew I needed to pursue music full-time," he said. In 1960, the Miracles became one of the first groups to sign with Motown, the record label that would permanently change American pop music. And from that very place, Smokey became not only the golden voice of his generation, but also the songwriting soul behind a string of timeless hits. "You've Really Got a Hold on Me," "Ooh Baby Baby," "The Tracks of My Tears," "My Girl," "Shop Around," "Tears of a Clown," all bear Smokey's imprint, whether as lead vocalist, co-writer, or producer. Throughout the 1960s, no one wrote about love with such tenderness, ache romance and sincerity, quite like Smokey Robinson. And the irony is this: the man who once slept in the poorest house in Detroit was now laying the foundation for the musical empire of the American dream. In 1972, he left the Miracles to spend more time with his family, but he never left music. He was appointed vice president of Motown, taking on a strategic role in bringing black artists into the mainstream. But whether on stage or in the boardroom, Smokey always carried with him the humble, heartfelt soul of a boy so poor he had to use safety pins to keep his pants up. The first cracks. In the 1960s and 70s, if there was a model for the ideal African-American artist, a man who embodied elegance, a sweet voice, and a picture-perfect family life, that name was Smokey Robinson. On stage, he was the definition of sophistication, carrying a quiet charm that made people believe he couldn't possibly make mistakes. But the dazzling light of that aura hid many things that were cracking in the shadows. And Smokey himself, years later, would be forced to admit those golden years were also the beginning of silent tragedies. In an interview with The Guardian, Smokey publicly admitted for the first time to an affair with Diana Ross, one of his closest friends and longtime Motown colleagues. The shock wasn't just in the names involved, but in the context at the time. Smokey was married to Claudette Rogers, the only female member of the Miracles, and a vocalist who matched him note for note. Claudette wasn't just a wife, she was a performing partner, a teammate, and his companion from the very start, building a career side by side. They had married in 1957 and were together for nearly 3 decades. It wasn't planned, Smokey said of the affair with Diana Ross. It just happened. But it was beautiful, and I don't regret it. He described Diana as beautiful, graceful, and deeply soulful, someone he still holds close to this day. No one pursued the other. It all happened naturally during long hours in the studio, executive meetings at Motown tours, and moments of musical synchronicity that felt almost absolute. Then one line blurred, not from physical desire, but from such intense emotional resonance that neither could deny it. The affair lasted about a year quietly, while the world still saw Smokey as the faithful husband, the model father. According to Smokey, it was Diana who chose to end it. She knew Claudette was the woman he truly loved, and she didn't want to break that apart. She knew Claudette and I loved each other deeply, he said. She was the one who decided to stop. But even though it ended peacefully, the relationship left a scar in Smokey's marriage that couldn't be erased. Claudette never spoke out. She never talked to the press or wrote a memoir. But within Motown, whispers about the fractured marriage had been circulating for years. By the 1970s, Smokey was seen alone more often at public events. Claudette, once his frequent companion on stage, became increasingly absent. She had stepped away from the Miracles in 1964 to focus on family. But emotional distance isn't something that can be bridged by silent sacrifices. Backstage photos, glances between Smokey and Diana, once read as collegial warmth, became clues to a secret buried too long. But Diana Ross wasn't the only one. During the strained years of their marriage, Smokey fathered a child with another woman, this time someone outside the music industry. And that was the end. Claudette had told him from the very beginning, one simple rule: you can do whatever you want, just don't bring me diseases or children. And Smokey had broken the last sacred boundary. When he confessed to her about the child, Claudette walked away. She didn't make a scene. She didn't go to the media. She just left. In 1986, their divorce officially ended a 27-year-long relationship, half of both their lives. But emotional pain wasn't all there was. Around the same time, Smokey fell into cocaine addiction. Not crack, he made clear powder. But that didn't lessen the destruction. I became a walking corpse, he recalled. I was down to 119 pounds. No clothes fit me, and I had to use safety pins to hold up my pants. He wore jackets to hide not just his emaciated body, but the deep, unspeakable shame. That was when Smokey began to hate himself. I had everything: fame, a career, people who loved me, and I destroyed it all. He said, if I had written my life like a perfect screenplay, it would have been the life I had, and I ripped it to shreds with my own hands. Those thoughts haunted him nightly. He didn't know why he turned to drugs. Maybe it was his father's death, a man he saw as an ideal figure. Maybe it was losing his closest friend, Marvin Gaye. Maybe it was the invisible pressure to uphold the image of the perfect man. Or maybe simply he had gone too far to come back. In the early years after the stage lights went dark, Smokey faced it all alone. Divorce, addiction, loss, and the ache of a beautiful but deceitful past. He once said, "You can try to run from pain, but no one can run from themselves." And that acknowledgement, free of excuses, free of blame, is what makes Smokey Robinson's story worth listening to. Because behind the light he once created was a darkness he dared to walk through. Then, one seemingly ordinary afternoon, a friend invited him over. A woman he calls his sister said she wanted to pray for him. He wasn't interested. He went out of courtesy, and because he had nothing better to do. "I was ready to die," Smokey said. "I thought, if she wants to pray, let her pray. I won't say a word." But what happened next wasn't something he had expected. That woman, whose name he didn't reveal, placed her hands on his head and began to pray. Not loudly, not forcefully, no exorcism. Just quiet, heartfelt whispers, as if speaking to a lost child. And in that moment, something lit up inside Smokey's heart. Not a flash of light, not a supernatural boom, just a simple, profound realization he didn't want to die. And he didn't have to. "It felt like a fog was lifted from my mind," he said. "Like someone wiped my glasses clean after years of cloudiness." When the prayer ended, he walked out of the room, and cocaine no longer had any pull. No detox meds, no rehab centers, no doctors. Just a sudden, complete awakening that defied logic. "I know some people don't believe in miracles," he said, "but I lived one. I'm living proof." From that day on, he never touched cocaine again. Friends called it a miraculous turnaround. The media was stunned. And Smokey. He returned to church, something he had neglected for nearly 40 years since his childhood in Detroit. He read the Bible daily. He began sharing his story with those at rock bottom. No preaching, no pressure. Just recounting what had happened with the humility of a man who had fallen and risen. It was during that same period that Smokey returned to the studio for the first time in years. The album Love Smokey, released in 1990, wasn't a massive hit, but it was a declaration he was still here, still creating, still had something to say. "I don't make music to climb charts anymore," he said. "I make music to remind myself that I didn't die." From music to hidden crimes. At its peak, Motown wasn't just a record label, it was an entire universe. A musical empire headquartered in Detroit, it turned unknown black kids into global icons. Marvin Gaye, Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder. The Temptations, the Supremes, all came out of the hit factory created by Berry Gordy, a former employee of Ford Motor Company. And at the center of that empire stood a man who appeared modest, but in reality held more power than anyone else, Smokey Robinson. But behind the smooth love songs and soul-stirring melodies, there was another side to Motown that few dared to mention. A world locked behind binding contracts, blind loyalty, and complicated entanglements between artists, money, and power. And as Smokey Robinson stepped out of the limelight, beat his addiction, and returned to real life, he began to see more clearly the things he once chose to ignore. Smokey had been an essential part of Motown's machinery, not just as an artist, but as a lead songwriter mentor company, vice president, and unofficial right hand to Berry Gordy. He introduced The Temptations, wrote My Guy for Mary Wells and My Girl for David Ruffin. At Motown, Smokey's word carried the weight of an executive, but with that power came compromises and sometimes enforced silence. In the 1960s and 70s, while Motown was praised publicly as a cultural icon of progressive America artists, within the label began whispering about a growing sense of loss of control. Many didn't own the songs they wrote or performed. Contracts often signed when they were young, poor, and uninformed bound them for life with unclear revenue splits. Some artists received less than 3% of recording profits. Others had no rights to their group names, or even the music they helped create. Motown was where soul music was born. Smokey once said, but it's also where many people lost their souls. There was one event from the mid-1970s that Smokey rarely mentioned, but in recent interviews he began to hint at it. A very well-known Motown artist was once threatened and beaten by his personal manager when trying to break out of a performance contract. Smokey didn't name names, but many suspect it involved a member of the Four Tops. Robinson was asked to intervene to use his influence to quiet it down. "I did it, but my heart broke," he said. "I knew it was wrong, but if I didn't step in, I'd be pulled into that mess too." There were also mysterious disappearances within Motown, musicians, editors, or sound engineers who vanished without a trace after leaving the company. A studio technician named Maurice W., who had worked on Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, was said to have quit music and moved to sell lumber in Canada. But no one ever saw him there. A background vocalist who had sung backup for the Supremes was found dead in her apartment, reportedly a suicide due to depression. But no forensic report was ever released. Just rumors, or signs of something darker. Smokey hasn't made any direct accusations, but he's left behind fragments. In a private interview in Detroit in 2023, he said Motown had 2 floors. One was music, the other was the stuff we were never allowed to ask about. The interviewer followed up. "What was on that floor?" He smiled. "Have you heard Tracks of My Tears?" Sometimes you have to smile while your heart is bleeding. Many in the music industry believe Smokey knows more than he says. A veteran music journalist once shared that in a private meeting, Smokey talked about missing money from Motown's artist retirement funds, millions of dollars unaccounted for. When he asked Berry Gordy about it, the founder simply poured another drink and changed the topic to an upcoming Motown film project. "Berry is a genius," Smokey said. But Motown wasn't a paradise, it was a business, and business has its own rules. Still, Smokey wasn't always on the outside. There were times he approved contracts for new groups like Rare Earth Sarita and the Undisputed Truth Acts that were often discarded after a few years if they didn't generate profit. He also personally greenlit the relocation of Motown's headquarters from Detroit to Los Angeles in 1972, a move criticized by many artists as the moment Motown lost its soul. When asked about it, he simply said, "It was what we needed to survive." But it's that very idea of survival that haunts him most. Because surviving in the music industry isn't easy, especially for a black man at a black label playing by the rules of a white industry. Smokey was once interrogated by the FBI in 1975 over unexplained contributions to black community organizations. Authorities suspected that Motown might be a front for money laundering or funding the Black Panther movement. No formal charges were filed, but the FBI's file remains officially open. In an unpublished memoir, Smokey described Motown as a two-headed snake, one side sacred, the other devouring everything it touched. When asked why he hasn't told everything he knows, he answered, "I'm not writing to get revenge. I'm writing to understand why I survived when so many of my friends didn't." Allegations and a prolonged legal battle. In the world of entertainment, there's no shortage of bitter separations between artists and their once-beloved partners. But few cases have lasted for decades and clung to both reputation and fortune, like the legal battle between Smokey Robinson and his ex-wife Claudette Rogers Robinson. Once the golden couple of Motown, they weren't just musical collaborators, but a symbol of timeless love. Yet behind the love songs, the smiles for the cameras, and the seemingly perfect performances, there was a slow, quiet unraveling. And when it finally exploded into a lawsuit, the world saw the final mask fall. Smokey and Claudette divorced in 1986 after more than 27 years of marriage and many storms. The official reason filed in court was irreconcilable differences, but the press already suspected that repeated affairs on Smokey's part, including one that resulted in a child out of wedlock in 1984, were the true cause. Claudette remained silent at the time, partly out of dignity, partly because she still loved him. But over time, the wounds never fully healed, and in 2021, she chose to speak out not for love, but for her legal rights. The center of the dispute lies in a seemingly simple clause in U.S. copyright law, the Copyright Revision Act of 1976, which allows authors to reclaim ownership of their works 35 years after signing away their rights. For the song Smokey wrote during the height of Motown, the likes of My Girl, The Tracks of My Tears, You've Really Got a Hold on Me, that meant he could fully regain ownership. And Smokey did exactly that. But Claudette objected. She argued that the songs were written during their marriage, and because California is a community property state, she is entitled to 50% of the profits from works her husband created while they were legally married. The issue was further complicated by the fact that many of the songs were copyrighted solely in Smokey's name, and the original Motown contracts rarely specified the distinction between personal and marital property. The lawsuit was filed in federal court in California, drawing intense attention from the music industry. If Claudette were to win, it could set a precedent for many other divorce cases in show business, where the real wealth lies in intellectual property, master recordings, song rights, creative work that seems intangible, but can generate millions over decades. Experts estimate that Smokey's royalties alone from songs written between 1960 and 1975 could be worth over $10 million at current market value. Smokey pushed back, citing federal law that the right to reclaim copyright is a personal and non-transferable right and not subject to community property laws. He also emphasized that many songs were written outside of work hours, without Claudette's involvement, and therefore could not be considered joint property. In court filings, his legal team described Claudette's claim as a deliberate legal distortion, exploiting past emotions for financial gain. Claudette, however, didn't back down. In an interview with Billboard, she said, "I'm not suing for money, I'm suing for justice. Those songs were part of my life. I lived through them. I witnessed them. I supported my husband through every sleepless night he wrote them. I can't stand by and watch my past be erased, like I was never there." The battle escalated when Motown, now owned by Universal Music Group, was pulled into the case. Legal teams worried that if Claudette won, major record labels could face hundreds of similar lawsuits from ex-spouses of songwriters dating back decades. An anonymous executive at Universal commented, "We're watching this closely. It's a ticking time bomb for the entire industry." By 2023, after 2 years of litigation, a federal judge issued a preliminary ruling favoring Smokey, affirming that copyright termination rights are personal and do not qualify as marital property. However, the court also allowed Claudette to appeal, and the case remains pending in a higher court. No one knows how it will end. But one thing is clear: it has already left deep scars, not just legally, but emotionally, between two people who once called each other the one and only love. Perhaps the most painful twist is that the very love songs that once defined them, songs tied to the image of an ideal artist couple, are now the center of legal warfare, where every note is a fragment of memory and every lyric a piece of evidence. "You are the light of my life." Smokey once wrote in "Ooh Baby Baby," a song dedicated to Claudette. But that light no longer guides it, only illuminates wounds that have yet to heal. From shock to empathy. When Smokey Robinson stepped into the light with his late-life confessions about addiction, extramarital affairs, copyright battles, and the hidden side of Motown, he didn't just open a door into his private world. He forced the music industry and global audiences alike to confront a much larger question. Do we truly understand the artists we worship? The initial public reaction was one of shock. To many, Smokey Robinson remained the king of love songs from Motown, the dapper man in a suit smiling behind the microphone with a voice as smooth as silk. So when he spoke of having fallen into the hell of addiction, of betraying his longtime wife, of witnessing deception behind the curtain of the music industry, even of doubting the very institutions that helped elevate him, that image was instantly shaken. On social media, early comments were largely critical. One user wrote, "I had My Girl on my wedding playlist. Now I can't hear it without thinking of everything he just admitted." Others felt betrayed. "I grew up with his music. And now I find out my whole childhood was shaped by songs from a man who cheated, used drugs, and is now casting suspicion on the very system that made him famous." But like music itself, human emotion is never one-dimensional. Public opinion began to shift after a few weeks. Critics, journalists, and fellow artists started to weigh in, not to defend Smokey, but to place everything in fuller context. In a column for The Atlantic, writer Ta-Nehisi Coates noted, "What Smokey has said is not an excuse. It's a rare admission from someone once seen as divine, now choosing to be human." That raw truth, flawed, unfiltered, led many to begin listening to him with a new emotion: empathy. Because behind the spotlight, everyone is human. Smokey's story of not knowing he was poor as a child, when 8 people in one house had to share half a bed, each resonated deeply, especially with Black audiences who grew up in similar conditions. Many younger artists also spoke up, unafraid to voice their support. HER posted on X, formerly Twitter, We need more icons like Uncle Smokey who tell the truth. Our generation needs to know that behind every hit is sweat, tears, and sometimes wounds that haven't healed. Chance the Rapper shared Smokey's interview with the caption, "Salvation isn't just in church, it's in owning your past." Even Diana Ross, long at the center of some of Smokey's most sensitive revelations, chose to respond with subtle grace. During a concert in Las Vegas after Smokey's memoir was released, she told the audience, "Music is life, and life isn't always easy. But if you sing through it, you survive." A short sentence, but for those who understood the context, it was a gesture of solidarity more than condemnation. Music industry executives responded more strategically. Many expressed concern that this moment could spark a wave of behind-the-scenes revelations from veteran artists, the kind of disclosures record labels have long avoided. One anonymous executive at Universal Music admitted, "We understand that audiences today want more than the music, they want the story behind it. But sometimes the truth is too complex to turn into content." Indeed, Smokey doesn't tell his story as a victim or a hero. He speaks as an old man standing in front of a mirror with nothing left to hide and nothing left to lose. In a recent TV talk show, when asked if he regretted revealing so much, he simply shook his head and smiled. "If I didn't say it, I'd take it to my grave. And that would be the real sin." In an age where the public image of artists is often worn down by scandal or manipulated by dishonest PR campaigns, Smokey Robinson's choice to unpack his life so directly has created a rare moment where the artist stops being a symbol and becomes human again. A human being with scars, with a past, with layered memories, but still standing still, singing. And perhaps that more than any lyric he ever wrote is Smokey Robinson's greatest legacy, a new definition of honesty in art and the courage to face oneself even at the age of 84. At 84, Smokey Robinson no longer tries to look away. He faces his past with awakened eyes, with a voice that has weathered decades of highs and lows to recount truths that are hard to accept but need to be told. His story isn't just the journey of a Motown legend. It's a reminder that sometimes light only comes after we dare to walk through our own darkness. If this story touched something in you, a memory, a feeling, or a new perspective on music history, help us share it further. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journeys, where we continue uncovering the lives behind the stage lights, the talents, the sorrows, and the legacies still waiting to be fulfilled.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.